All for coming to this special event in history. It's with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Ken Mayer to the University of Newcastle this afternoon. Professor Mayer teaches political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's a leading scholar of American government and institutions and also campaign financing. He's the author of several important books on these subjects, including With the Stroke of a Pen, Executive Orders and Presidential Power with Princeton University Press, and The Political Economy of Defence Contracting with Yale University Press. His articles have appeared in high-profile journals such as the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics and Legislative Studies Quarterly, and in 2006 Professor Mayer held the inaugural Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Political Science at the Australian National University. Today he's going to be talking about Barack Obama's first term in office and the President's prospects, I think, for re-election. So, Professor Mayer, I welcome you. We all welcome you. Thank you for making the trip to Newcastle.
Thank you for coming out. I am beyond delighted to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is reviewing President Obama's first term and the meaning of that term with respect to how voters are evaluating President Obama and his re-election, which at this point I would regard the election as extremely close. There was a Democratic pollster named Peter Hart who stated a few days ago that in his view the election was a toss-up. I'll try to provide some reasons, explanations about why that's true. But I want to start out with making some observations about the American president and some of the key distinctions between the Australian system of government and the American system of government, because that has a dramatic effect on how voters are evaluating Obama in ways that may seem very strange to Australians who look at our political system and find it impenetrable, obtuse, deeply obscure, with language and strategies that make no sense. And all I can say is that's how we feel about cricket. So, first observation about the American president is that the public holds the president to expectations that vastly exceed the actual powers of the office, that it is not at all like parliamentary systems in which a government with a majority in the House of Representatives it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but in most respects can do whatever the party will support. And again, there are some things that they would not be able to do. But that's vastly different from the American president, who is constrained not just by a more limited set of powers that apply to our federal government, but also in terms of the structure of our government, which actually precludes efficient and effective action in ways that would seem almost incomprehensible to people who live in democratic countries with a parliamentary system. Unlike a parliamentary system, which is by definition a unified government, there is no distinction between the government and the cabinet and the party that holds the majority in the House of Representatives. We have a distinct system which has distinct allocations of power to three branches: the Congress, the President, and the judiciary. And the Australian judiciary is independent in the sense that it is insulated from public approval and public passions. But in my view, I think it's true that the Australian judiciary is more deferential to the acts of Parliament than the American federal judiciary and the Supreme Court is to acts of Congress and acts of the President, reflected in the fact that in about a month, possibly sooner, the Supreme Court is very likely to overturn the single most important piece of domestic legislation that has been passed since the 1960s, which is the health care bill that Obama signed into law in 2010. We also have a much higher degree of federalism than Australia, with 6 states and 2 territories. We have 50 separate states with very, very distinct character, and I understand that nobody would probably confuse South Australia with Queensland, but I think the distinction between, say, New Hampshire and Texas defies even that. Every time I go to Texas, I always start, and always gets a laugh. I tell them, I bring you greetings on behalf of the government of the United States of America, and they think that's hilarious. And it also is the point where they put away their guns, which is very nice. We'll talk about that later. So I'm going to frame this discussion about Obama's first term in the context of the specific promises that he made coming into his election, and I'm going to focus on 3 of them because they were some of the most important promises that he made. They were actually unusually specific for promises made in the heat of a presidential campaign. And he has had mixed success in carrying out these promises in ways that have implications for his presidency. The first thing that Obama promised was to change the tone of political discourse, that politics in the United States has become a contact sport where the politics is polarized, and people in the political parties are often willing to metaphorically fight to the death over issues. In effect, I think, if you brought Thomas Jefferson from 1787 to 2012, and he was not a fan of political parties. He saw them as a dangerous form of faction that encouraged people to place their partisan interests, their sectional interests over the need of the country. He would look at what's happening in the United States and say, I told you. Our parties do not get along. The public is polarized. Parties are polarized. And Obama came to office promising hope and change, which he repeated many, many times. And the reason that was such an effective campaign promise, and also the reason why it was so treacherous, is that it is ambiguous enough so that it can mean just about anything. And people projected their own desires and their own beliefs onto that. And it inevitably has led to frustration. The second thing that President Obama, or candidate Obama, promised to do was enact universal health care, which was much of the debate during the primaries and his competition with then Senator Hillary Clinton, now Secretary of State, was over who had the best plan for enacting universal health care, which was absolutely central to the domestic agenda that Obama had promised. And then third, looking outward, Obama promised repeatedly that he would modify America's counterterrorism strategy, both focused outwards, closing Guantanamo and ending the practice of indefinite detention, and in his view, restoring the position of America as a beacon of the rule of law, that he would bring the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to successful conclusions, and that he would end aggressive interrogation techniques that had become enormously controversial in the U.S., not just waterboarding, which had already been essentially banned by law by this time, but other techniques that the military and intelligence agencies have been using, sleep deprivation, exposure to extremes of heat and cold, and so forth. And all of these promises were made repeatedly and explicitly, and so there was not a lot of wiggle room for a candidate, for a president to say, well, that's not exactly what I meant. And there's been some success, some elements of these Obama has not been successful, and it again frames, I think, the attitudes of a lot of the public, particularly some of his most enthusiastic supporters in 2008, who are decidedly less enthusiastic, not in the sense that they're not going to vote for him, but they're unlikely to turn out in the same numbers as they did in 2008. And if we have time, we can engage in a discussion about why there's no compulsory voting in the United States. the political environment that faced President Obama when he took office. And the interesting thing about this is none of this was anticipated in any concrete sense until about a month before the election. We have faced the worst economic downturn in the U.S. since the Great Depression. And that's something that Australians, you have been fortunate to avoid some of the worst aspects of this. We had very close to a complete meltdown of our financial and banking sectors with the collapse of large financial institutions as a result of the housing bubble and massive overinvestment in extremely risky and interlocked and complicated financial products, which were so complicated nobody understood them. And when it went south in a hurry, to the point where the largest bankruptcy in American history occurred with Lehman Brothers. Most of the large commercial banks on the verge of collapse, and hundreds of billions of dollars in what we would call toxic assets, meaning there were liabilities on the books of these banks, but no one had any idea how much they were worth, and they were essentially unmarketable. No one was willing to pay anything for these assets, and so the entire banking system freezed up to the point where, without massive government intervention, it would have collapsed, and the gears of the economy would have not just ground to a halt, but they would have broken. The gross domestic product, the measure of total economic activity, dropped at an annual rate of nearly 9%. And this is about probably 3 times the largest annual drop in gross domestic product since the Depression. Unemployment more than doubled from 4.5% to 10% over the same period. It remains high, and there is quite a bit of argument in the U.S. about even whether this unemployment rate, which is now at about 8.2%, whether it's accurate in the sense that it counts a lot of people as employed who are not employed full-time, who are underemployed, people with professional degrees, college degrees who are working in retail or service positions, and that the true unemployed, I can tell you that it feels like the economy is still in deep recession, even though it actually is not. This was not something that just affected the United States. Global trade dropped by nearly 1/5 between 2008 and 2009. So no president would wish to be elected under these circumstances, and yet this is not something that Obama chose. It was not something that he did, and yet this is always true. It doesn't matter whether it's Obama or Republican, wouldn't matter. Presidents are always held responsible for bad economic times, even when it's not their fault, even when it is true that presidents simply don't have the tools to change economic policy in the short term to achieve the right mix and bring the country out of recession. If it were true, we would never go into recession. And this affected the political environment because the immediate response to the downturn and the seizing up of the financial markets meant that there was actually, by the time the government was through responding to this, and when I say government, I don't mean government in the Australian sense, I mean Congress acting, President signing, and implementation. By the time Congress got through acting on this, the stimulus and financial rescue, which came in basically 2 waves, a $700 billion rescue plan for the financial industry to loan them money so that they could hold on, that they could address the problem of toxic assets. $800 billion in a classic Keynesian economic counter-cyclical stimulus to inject money into the economy to bring us out of the recession faster. Within about 4 months, between October 2008 and probably February 2009, perhaps 5 months, we had spent $1.5 trillion on just these 2 things, and that's about 5 times what Australia spends over the course of an entire year. This meant that the fiscal condition of the government was decimated is probably the wrong word, but it certainly created situations that no president would choose to come to office with. tax revenue, as always happens in economic downturns, as economic activity declines, tax revenues go down. People are making less money. At the same time, tax revenues go down, expenditures go up, financial rescue, stimulus, unemployment, transfer payments, welfare, all these things have a dramatic effect, so that our deficit went, the amount of money that we had to borrow in order to pay the annual budget went from $161 billion in 2007 to $1.4 trillion in fiscal 2009, and it has stayed at about these levels. It's come down a little bit. There's an old classic saying from a longtime Illinois senator named Everett Dirksen, who was in the 1950s was lamenting the fact that budget discussions in the United States don't have any analogy in the real world, and he said that people are talking as if, a billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon it adds up to real money. Now we could update that to 100 billion here and 100 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. So given this, I'm now going to talk about the promises and prospects for Obama in his first term. So we know that polarization is a consistent phenomenon in American politics. For a long time we debated about whether it was real or whether it was something that was simply political elites and party leaders fighting with each other. There's now, I think, conclusive evidence that it is real, it is widespread, it occurs at the grassroots level, and it has an impact on the fact that the parties are in fact diverging, and various methods we have of trying to estimate the ideology of members of Congress. 30 years ago, there was lots of overlap in the middle with conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans existing towards the center. Now, both of those distributions have shifted to the point where the most conservative Democrat in the United States House of Representatives is more conservative. The most conservative Democrat is less conservative than the most liberal Republican. And so there is no overlap, and that means that the moderates in both parties have either been driven out, and this is not just a Democratic phenomenon, not just a Republican phenomenon. The Republican voters have organized to throw out moderate to liberal. Well, Richard Lugar is not a liberal, but conservative to moderate Republicans. He was beaten in his primary in 2006. It was the Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman, who the only issue he was not a classic liberal on was the war in Iraq, that he supported that. And the Democrats in the Connecticut primary election threw him out by electing his opponent. And so 3 years later, how are we doing? Well, Democrats, the answer is not very well. If you watch, I don't know how many American news programs you get here, but it's a common lament. And unfortunately, unlike, I think, bananas, which are still not legally imported into Australia, you have imported this strategy from us, and I'm very sorry that we had to produce it. Although, fortunately, I understand that scandal is still not something that reaches Australian politics. I offered, well, I guess I'm not in Canberra anymore, but I suppose it would be impolitic for me to suggest that we would do a straight-up swap, Craig Thompson for John Edwards. I think we would get the better part of that deal. Democrats argue that the Republican Party, GOP, is an abbreviation, grand old party from a century ago, that Mitch McConnell, who is the Senate Minority Leader, the leading Republican in the U.S. Senate, stated shortly after President Obama was reelected that the overriding goal for Republicans in the next 3 years was to make sure that Obama did not get reelected. And, that's where things are. And Democrats have responded that the Republican Party is purely obstructionist, that they have rejected every instance of Obama trying to reach across the aisle. They are in constant attack mode, not interested in compromise. And there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who, pouring gasoline on this fire, make the point explicitly that the opposition is not rooted in principled policy differences, but by the fact that their claim is that a lot of this opposition in the Republican Party is motivated by simple racism. Republicans respond that it's the Democrats who are adopting divisive strategies. There's been a lot of controversy over repeated Democratic claims that the Republican Party is waging a war on women. I saw the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, in floor debates, not really floor debates. I wish that we had developed, as Australia has, the rhetorical tradition in which we like politicians to speak in complete sentences, and we haven't done so well in that. But on the floor of the House of Representatives, on what was otherwise a minor budgetary bill, the former Speaker of the House said essentially that the only reason Republicans are trying to play games with this legislation is they don't care if women and children die. That doesn't strike me as a very good strategy for trying to bring people together. Republicans say that Obama is vilifying opponents, calling out and publicly criticizing individuals and political organizations that are contributing to Mitt Romney's campaign, that he's stoking racial tension by injecting himself into racially charged incidents, and instead of trying to tamp down a lot of the controversy, has actually made them worse, and that he's ruining the country, trying to turn it into a European-style socialist country. And that's another issue. I've been asked a number of times by students, why, when anybody says the word socialist, we all in America, clutch at our pearls and head for the fainting couch. There are cultural reasons for that, but it remains true. And the result is that polarization has actually gone up since George Bush was president. That if you look at the years in which Republicans and Democrats had the widest gaps in their approval of a president, almost all of them have occurred in the last 10 years. And every time the Gallup organization comes out with a new poll, Obama, most polarized president in the third term. Obama, most polarized president in this quarter in his third year. It is enduring, and it simply has not gotten better. The reason is that this is simply not something that a president has the power to address. It is not up to the president to determine what the tone of political debate is. We are in a situation where it's a rhetorical analog to an arms race, that the first person to everybody says they want to restore civility in politics, but the first person to actually do that, or the first side to actually do that, is at a tremendous disadvantage when the other side doesn't disarm, because the fact is that voters respond to these strategies and reward it or don't punish it. So, there was a lot of disillusionment among people who were enthusiastic about Obama, that all this hope and change turned into more of the same. And I've been around studying politics enough to be terribly cynical and to say, this always happens. I wrote an essay about, now it's going on 10 years, where I was dealing with the fact that presidents come to office with great expectations that are always dashed, and I referred to a famous American, sort of a 19th century version of Mark Twain, Samuel Johnson, who referred to remarriage as the triumph of hope over experience, and that's the same thing that can be said for presidential inaugurations. So, healthcare reform. The U.S. does not have universal health care. There are a lot of reasons for that. We can go into it in the Q&A, but it produces a system with a number of problems. It is expensive. We spend twice per capita what any other country does on health care. It is inefficient, that it does not produce the best outcomes in terms of some of the typical markers of health care outcomes: infant mortality, life expectancy, the percentage of the public that has chronic diseases. And it also has the pathology that there are tens of millions of people in the United States who lack health insurance and therefore have trouble gaining access to consistent care, and to the extent that they do in emergency rooms, it winds up being a burden to hospitals and governments. There had been a number of attempts in the United States to enact this going back to the 1930s with the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt. They all failed. Most recently in 1994 with Bill Clinton's health care, which was trying to create a system of kind of a hybrid single payer, never got close to being enacted. So one of the, we can talk about the process in 2009, 2010. One of the things that Democrats, particularly liberal Democrats, wanted to see was a single payer system along the lines of the Canadian or British healthcare system, with government the sole provider and sole funder of healthcare that simply provides universal coverage to everybody, irrespective of your insurance status or anything else. You're in the country, you're a citizen, legal resident, you get access to the system. That's a non-starter in the sense that for this reason alone, the United States, we spend about $3 trillion a year on healthcare. It's about 1/6 of the economy, and it's slowly creeping up. Another 10 years, it'll probably be a fifth. About half of that money, about $1.5 trillion, is spent by governments. Medicaid, Medicare, which covers everybody over 65, not in a single payer mode, but the government pays doctors who provide care, so about veterans care, all that, about half of it. That means the other half is paid for privately, mostly through private insurance. There is a small to the tune of a couple of $100 billion perhaps of medical care that's actually paid for out of pocket. The rest of it is all paid for by insurance companies. So you have a health insurance industry of about $1.5 trillion, and you simply can't make that go away by nationalizing or creating a single payer system. It's just not feasible. And so that means that you have to find a way to incorporate a universal coverage system within the context of the system that exists. And so as a matter of practicality, and there were people who were very disappointed when single payer was very quickly abandoned, instead what Congress created was a compromise that piggybacked a healthcare delivery system with, I'm just going to take this out of my pocket for now, that utilized the private insurance market to make sure that everybody had insurance coverage. And the legislation did this in two ways. The first is that it prohibited health insurers from denying coverage to people because they had pre-existing conditions. And it also prohibited insurance companies from charging higher premiums to people who had pre-existing conditions. If you were trying to purchase an individual policy, not through your employer, not through Medicare, and you had diabetes, had cancer, had a chronic disease like arthritis, you would simply not be able to purchase health insurance. Nobody would give you a policy, or if they did, it would be so exorbitantly expensive. I mean, we're talking $50,000, $60,000 a year just for insurance. You simply couldn't do it. And that's because no insurance companies are businesses, and they don't make money if they sell a policy for $10,000. And I'm in the U.S., $10,000 would be very cheap for a health insurance policy. My health insurance for my family, and it's considered a relatively affordable policy, costs $17,000 a year. And I think I said this at a high school, and you could almost see the students' jaws drop and hit their desk. And they said, well, you know, we argue over whether $40 a fortnight is outrageous. And that would be, fortnight is 2 weeks, so that would be about $1,000 a year. But now that practice has ended. Insurance companies must issue policies to anybody who comes and applies. They can't charge more for pre-existing conditions. They can't refuse policies because, I mean, you could have need a heart transplant and approach an insurance company, they would have to cover you. Well, turns out insurance companies accepted this because there was another half which said, now everybody must purchase health insurance. There's an individual mandate, which essentially meant that turns out of the people who don't have insurance, many of them don't have insurance because they can't get an affordable policy. Well, that's taken care of. But there are people who don't have health insurance because they make a choice. And it's not an accident that people who choose not to have health insurance are young, healthy, not heavy users of healthcare services. And so by forcing them to come in and enter the market, insurance companies are better off because they have to cover sick people, but they're now guaranteed an additional 40 million customers, and they actually were quite happy with this. If you don't have health insurance, you have to pay a penalty to the government. And so the idea is that everybody would be forced into a nationwide insurance pool. And you can't have one without the other. You cannot have must-issue rules without a guarantee that you're going to be bringing in lots of healthy people who are going to pay $5,000 or $6,000 a year and not use anywhere close to that in terms of healthcare services. And this was controversial. And again, there are some particular elements of American politics and political culture and our political ethos about why this is unpopular. But it looked very bad because opponents of this bill began to mobilize. And when Congress adjourned in the summer of 2009 and all the members went home to have town hall meetings in their districts, these opponents of the bill were prepared with very specific questions about what the bill would do, what the provisions are, and virtually every member of Congress who supported the bill, they were unable to answer the most basic questions about what it would do. And they looked very bad. Nancy Pelosi, who was the Speaker of the House at that point, was pushed on this and about what was in the bill, and she made, which turned out to be something that I'm sure she wished she hadn't said, that, well, we need to pass the bill first, and then we'll find out what's in it, which is not, there are about 9 different reasons why that's not a good thing. And as the bill wound its way through the political process, it passed without a single Republican vote. Not one Republican in either the House or the Senate voted in favor of it. And there were a small number there were 34 Democrats in the House who voted against it. So it passed by basically all the Democrats in the Senate voted for it. It passed narrowly in the House. So it was a controversial bill, even as it wound its way through the process. The political consequences were stark. The bill was finally enacted in about March 2010. In our midterm elections, which occur halfway through the president's term when a third of the Senate and all of the House have to run, the Democrats lost 63 seats, which is the worst showing for an incumbent party since 1938. So Democrats passed this bill. It was unpopular, and they had the worst showing in midterm elections in 72 years. And they lost the majorities that they had recaptured 4 years earlier because of public dissatisfaction with the progress of the war in Iraq. To make it even worse, the Affordable Care Act, as it's called, is likely to be overturned by the Supreme Court as an unconstitutional exercise of Congress's constitutional power, because it goes beyond what Congress is authorized to do under the Constitution. If that happens, Obama will have committed his entire, it's a little bit of a simplification to talk about political capital as a physical construct where you spend a little bit to get what you want. But what this means is that Obama will have committed his entire domestic agenda and every ounce of effort and influence he had to a piece of legislation that was both enormously unpopular and which will have no effect. So he will have incurred major political consequences and gained nothing. Now, this is not Obama's fault directly. What is, I think, attributable to decisions that Obama made is that the president made a decision, which now appears to be a very bad one, that he was going to leave it to Congress to write this legislation and was not going to get involved and stayed out and let members of Congress fight it out, alienating Democrats who wished that he had pushed harder for more government involvement and angering Republicans who were angry about the bill in any regard. And there's a famous saw that is attributed to Bismarck, where more or less there are two things that you never want to see being made: sausage and legislation, because the processes are ugly. And indeed, that was very true here. So let me move quickly through the war on terror. I'm going to talk specifically about one specific promise, which was his promise to close Guantanamo. He said this repeatedly, explicitly, during the campaign, after he got elected, in the transition: I will close Guantanamo, and unusually explicit. So, I mean, the result was campaigning is very, very different from governing. I mean, this is universal. It's true here. It's true just about. It's true in every democratic system. That the things that you can do during the campaign, that there's no consequence to making broad promises during the campaign about what you will do. In part because nobody calls you on it. Nobody pushes you to explain the trade-offs that you would need to make. I will close Guantanamo. Nobody really even asked the questions. Senator Obama, what are you going to do with the people who were there? Response: I've said I'm going to close Guantanamo. Well, let me ask again. What are you going to do with the people who were there? And the answer: squirrel. You change the subject, and you get away with it because the time cycle is so short. The next day, you've moved on to something else. Senator McCain said something that you could latch onto. There were no political costs to making this promise. But once you get elected, things change. Obama gets elected president. He is now responsible for the national security of the United States. And there's a moment during the transition that's chronicled in a couple of books that were written about it, when as a kind of courtesy, major party presidential candidates are often given briefings by intelligence agencies about things that are going on, just to prepare them in the event that they get elected. Well, Obama gets elected about 2 weeks after he is elected, and we spend about 2.5 months between the election and the inauguration, which again is something that must look very strange to Australians when you have an election. Probably within 2 or 3 days, the new government is in place. You have shadow ministers, shadow cabinet. It happens instantly. In the U.S., it takes much longer. About 2 weeks after Obama was elected, he got the full intelligence briefing, where intelligence officials showed him what is variously referred to as the full threat matrix, or as reporters like to call it, the family jewels. And this is the first time that it was a very sobering moment for Obama, who now realized the full range of threats that he would have to deal with, and he was not going to be able to finesse these anymore. Now, with respect to Guantanamo, he has to make some specific decisions. What do you do with the detainees? Now you have to answer that question. Do you let them go? Not a good idea, particularly when you're talking about, at this point, most of the easy calls had been addressed and people had been let go. We're now down to about 170 people, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind behind September 11th, people who were involved in the attack on the USS Cole, which killed 24 American sailors. Letting them go is not something that any president would be able to survive. Relocating them to the U.S., not an option, because it was politically so difficult. Even Democrats in Congress said, no way. About 9 months after taking office, the Attorney General Eric Holder floated the idea that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was going to be transferred to a civil court in New York and tried there. And everybody went bananas. The liberal Democratic members of Congress and the Senate said absolutely not, and they had to back off from that. Well, if you can't let them go and you can't relocate them to the U.S., 2 other options. One would be to take a page from a John le Carré novel and perhaps stick them all in a submarine, tow it out to the middle of the Atlantic, and sink it. Not a good idea for a candidate who had promised to restore the rule of law. The last option on the table is you leave them there, and that's exactly where we are. In my view, I think that Guantanamo will remain open until either the last detainee dies, and we could be talking 40 years or longer, or until the population gets so small that you have a handful of 70-year-old detainees who then it would be less controversial to move them to the United States. And this is something that, and in fact, Obama also restarted the military tribunals about a month ago, and so we're there. So where does that, I'm going to skip this next slide. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with divergent views of the Obama administration to his supporters. And his supporters constitute perhaps half of the engaged electorate, maybe a little bit more than half, that he's protected people from the worst abuses of wealthy and rapacious interests, has restored the image of the U.S. globally, and that the only reason he hasn't done more is that Republicans are more interested in seeing him fail than in actually doing things to help the country. Well, Republicans respond that he is a financially reckless statist, which is what we say instead of socialist, who has ignored the economy and is driving the country off a fiscal cliff. And there is not a lot of room for negotiation here, particularly in the campaign. And it's to the point where was it? It was in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning, a story about the massacre in Syria, which the world has concluded that Assad has gone too far, but the chief stumbling block to any U.S. effort to try to remove him from power is that the Russians are supportive because they're a key ally. And in the Sydney Morning Herald, in a news story, noted that the U.S. is probably not going to succeed because Putin is going to play games and try to make Obama look weak, which could have implications for the U.S. presidential election, because things that go wrong abroad will give ammunition to Republicans. And even Obama himself had indicated a couple times over the previous 6 months that he now thinks that it might have been a mistake to spend so much time on health care to the exclusion of jobs in the economy. So what this means is, with regard to the election, in my view, it is going to turn largely on the state of the economy, and to a lesser extent health care reform. But the thing is that most of the people who are going to use health care as their metric, most of them have already made up their minds. If they liked health care, they are going to vote for Obama. If they don't like health care, they're not going to vote for Obama, but that is going to be swamped by the issue of the economy. And the reason is that the health care bill, people who are most strongly opposed are not going to vote for Obama in any event, and abundant evidence that the enthusiasm, the rock star aura that Obama had in 2008 has dissipated because he now has a record. His record is largely, in terms of swing voters, is going to be a function of their views on the economy. So I think I will stop here and be happy to take questions that you would have. Do you want to moderate, or?
Yeah, I'm happy.
Okay.
Well, thank you firstly for that talk, Professor Mayer. Stimulating.